It's a pleasure to be with you, and those of you who are hither and yon, maybe more yon than hither, but we're grateful for those of you who are here, and especially, I'll tell you this, if you're here as the result of the possibility God is calling you into one of these areas, it thrills me to death, because throughout the whole filming, we continue to talk to these scientists about how critical it is that we get young people to listen to the call of God to go into these different areas. And so we're grateful that you're here. We're going to begin laying some groundwork this morning, and we're not going to talk about anything profound. We're going to talk about things that you're probably very familiar with. But it's good to ask the question. In the same way that Paul asked the question, we was talking about how critical the reality of the historical resurrection of Christ was. And he asked the question, well, basically, what if Christ was not raised from the dead? And the consequences that our faith is in vain. And so we're going to ask that same question now as it applies to Genesis, in particular those first 11 chapters of Genesis, and the consequences of when we change that genre in Genesis from historical narrative to some other genre. What are the consequences? Now, we're dealing first of all with the issue of truth, because we want to understand what is the truth about Genesis, because there are some who would say that if you interpret Genesis from a different genre, then we're reading a different kind of truth there. In the same way that you're probably familiar, we've seen a number of shows that have been created entitled "In the Search for Historical Jesus." And if you've seen those, you will realize that those who made the show come up with something other than the historical Jesus that we're familiar with. And the reason is because they view the references that we have about Jesus in the Gospels and the rest of the Scripture as something other than historical narrative. There is a reason for that. Christians usually understand that God has spoken to us in two ways. The first is through His Word. We call that special revelation. I'm going to speak of that as primary truth. He has also spoken to us through what He has made. The heavens declare the glory of God. Paul makes that point in Romans chapter 1, where he says that we are without excuse. Why? Because even the invisible attributes of God are understood by what He has made. So that God has given us not only the special revelation in the Word that He has written, as He has inspired men to write those words, but He has also revealed who He is. Paul says even His invisible attributes, His divine nature and character, understood by what He has made. We call that general revelation. In the context here, I'm calling that secondary truth. Now, what we understand is that what God has revealed to us in His special revelation is the primary truth that we go to. In other words, we understand the truth about God in general revelation as a result of the special revelation that He's given to us. And that's why I call it primary truth, and this is secondary truth. It's still true, and they do not conflict with each other. But we begin first with the Scriptures. Now, the reason that is important is because in the issue, in this debate, creation debate, I would submit to you that what has happened is that Christians, and I think well-meaning Christians, but they have had a tendency to believe that the scientific explanation for what we see around us becomes primary truth, and then we begin to try and interpret special revelation in light of that scientific understanding. Does that make sense? So my particular position that I'm submitting to you is that what's happened is we've switched these around. Instead of the Scripture being primary truth, we've made it secondary truth when it comes to this issue. And that leads us to talk briefly about the source of truth that underlies the current science paradigm that reigns and rules. Later on, no doubt, we will have the opportunity to talk about the history of science and how scientific paradigms have arisen in the past. They have reigned, they have ruled, they have captured the hearts and minds of people. Questions are not allowed outside of that paradigm, and then they've crashed. And then another paradigm arises and takes its place. We are in the midst of the current science paradigm, and it too has captured the culture, it captures the questions. You're not allowed to ask questions outside of that paradigm. But this current paradigm is based upon naturalism, the philosophy of naturalism. They're wedded together, and it's important to understand that because naturalism would say to us that the only thing that exists in reality is the material world. We'll call it the cosmic cube. Nothing exists outside of that cosmic cube. Now, if you wed that philosophy, naturalism, with a scientific paradigm or a science paradigm, then what you have is an investigation of the world around us that will not allow a conclusion that points outside of the box. Does that make sense? So what we have is a paradigm that is preordained to never interpret the data to point to anything outside of the box. So it's a scientific paradigm built upon naturalism, and it cannot, will not, find evidence that points anything outside of the box. That is why, for example, if we go back to the example of the search for the real Jesus or the historical Jesus, is that this paradigm will allow us to understand the historical narrative as long as it keeps Jesus in this box. Does that make sense? But as soon as Jesus begins to do things that are outside of the box, miracles, or he speaks coming from God and those kinds of things, then those are either not allowed or they get interpreted in a different way, and oftentimes they're twisted into another genre. All right? So that's a critical thing for us to begin with. I think George Walden, these quotes are very helpful to us to see that current paradigm and the limitation it places upon the scientific investigation. So George Wald, in speaking of spontaneous generation, and that's the notion that life arises from non-life, he says this: most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. So do you see what he's saying? He's saying that if we say that spontaneous generation does not occur, then we are only left with the possibility of some supernatural event, some supernatural cause. But because we can't go outside of the box, that's what we're left with. So then he says, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are. As a result, I believe in spontaneous generation. Now, this is not to point a finger at George Wald here. It's an attempt to help us understand that the current science paradigm is bound up in this philosophy, and therefore it cannot see outside. And the reason that is important for us is that as we see Christians begin to take this paradigm's conclusions as primary truth, we're walking on, and we need to recognize that we are now putting faith in a philosophy that can never point outside of that box. Does that make sense? Okay. This has not always been true. A very interesting statement by Kepler. The chief aim of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. So Kepler and those also were involved in really the beginning of what we would call modern science, were not bound by that philosophy. They were willing, if the evidence pointed to God, in fact, in some cases, I would say that they even expected that evidence to point to God, that they were willing to follow that evidence to something outside of the box. The other foundational thing we need to talk about quickly is the notion of time. Time is a critical element here, and you can see why. Because a natural process, if it is squeezed into a short period of time, becomes a miracle. So the making of wine, for example, is a somewhat lengthy process. And if it is lengthy, then it can be viewed as a natural process. We do that all the time today. No one would say that the little winemaker in California is performing a miracle when he creates wine, because he follows a standard long process. But if Jesus speaks wine into existence in a short period of time, and we don't know whether Jesus used that process and speeded it up, we don't know that, or whether they just in fiat spoke it into being. But the point is that it happened in a short period of time. And when it happened in a short period of time, that's the miraculous work of God, is the hand of God, who speaks and everything comes into being. Now, naturalism would say that the effects that we see around us in the natural world have to be the result of a long process. Because what happens if they're confronted with any evidence that says it's not a long process? What are they confronted with? This is a classroom. And in a classroom, it's different than a speaker. You're treating me like a speaker. If a scientist uncovers evidence that a process occurred in a very short period of time rather than the length of time that they think might be necessary for it to happen, what are they confronted with? A miracle. And a miracle is something outside of the box. And a miracle cannot be allowed. And so is it possible for this scientific paradigm to look at the evidence and come up with anything that is supernatural, anything that would be called a miracle? It cannot. So time is also a very critical issue here. And that is why, and we don't want to delve too much into the notion of motive here, but that is why you cannot find anything but deep time in the evidence. Because if you find something other than deep time in the evidence, you're confronted with this. And we're back to George Wald, who said, look, I know that spontaneous generation is impossible. And the more we look, and you'll hear from especially some of our microbiologists, we are uncovering more and more as we go deeper and deeper into life and the complexity of life, that it's even more impossible that it could have happened. And yet, in Wald's mind and in this philosophical mind, you cannot see that as anything but impossible, and yet we believe it. And we believe it had to happen because we're confronted with an alternative that we cannot accept. George Wald, then also, will stick with him for a while. Time is the hero of the plot. What we regard as impossible on the basis of human experience is meaningless here. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. So do you understand here how important time is? Because it's almost like our national debt. You know, when it gets to be a certain size, our mind just goes fuzzy. And that's of great benefit. Otherwise, we'd be worried about this horrendous debt that we have because it's so huge, we can't even get our minds around it. And so when we talk about deep time, we talk about this magic wand of deep time that now makes everything possible. So deep time is a critical aspect of a naturalistic philosophy. And when it gets wedded to science, then that means that we must find deep time. We are compelled to find deep time. We have to. Okay, one other final thing, and I think Dr. Steve Boyd will probably go into this more deeply. But we need to understand that when it comes to understanding the written communication that God has given to us, and when we understand any written communication, or even when people speak to us, we need to understand what genre they are speaking. Now, in most cases, when human beings communicate with one another, we are invariably speaking in what we would call historical narrative. I got up this morning, I had breakfast, I drove here. Yesterday, I was over here. Tomorrow, we may even speak in the future, but we're talking about reality. Now, it's possible you may run into someone who is speaking poetry, and the clue is they're wearing tights or tutus or something. But normally, it's historical narrative. And that is true when we come to the Scripture as well. Because when we look at the Scripture, we are primarily reading throughout the Scripture historical narrative. Is that not true, Dr. Boyd? The vast majority of what God has given to us is historical narrative. But we also know that God has spoken to us in the genre of poetry. We know that Jesus spoke in what he called and what the Scripture calls parables. But we recognize those, and they're very clear. Paul in Galatians 4 clues us. He said, this is an analogy, and he tells us that. And it's important for us hermeneutically, in other words, how do we understand the Scripture? It's important for us to know when is God speaking in something other than historical narrative. Is he speaking now in poetry? And that is obvious to us as well. When the psalmist speaks of God covering us with his feathers and his wings, we don't think then that God is some big bird. We see that. So that's the issue now is whether or not these first 11 chapters of Genesis fall into historical narrative, or they fall into myth, or they fall into poetry, and that becomes a fundamental hermeneutical issue, especially within Christianity. Now, those who do not believe in God, those who fall in the camp we'll call the atheistic evolutionists, for example, they're not even interested in what this says. Maybe there are some historical pieces they might be interested in. But for the other segments of the creation debate within Christianity, it's that issue. What genre are we looking at? And I am convinced, and I think when Dr. Boyd speaks and so forth, I'm convinced that you cannot interpret this any other way but historical narrative. In fact, I would submit to you that the only way that one would interpret these passages other than historical narrative is if you first believe there's another truth that is primary. And that is this truth. And that's what we find happening today. So the question before us is, what happens then if we begin to view this in the spirit, say, of Paul asking the question, what happens if Christ did not rise from the dead? And I will go through these fairly quickly with you because I think all of these are quite obvious to us. It's just a matter of walking through them and refreshing ourselves to understand how critical these first passages are. They are not minor, and I know that you have spoken with other believers as well as I have who have made this statement that what difference does it make? What difference does it make if you see Genesis in a different position? And what we're trying to submit here is that it makes a critical difference to us. What we find in these first 11 chapters of Genesis is the origin of the universe, of matter, of energy, of order. These are the beginnings of the fundamental questions that are asked by the philosophers. And it's not just the philosophers who ask these questions, because we ask these questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where did all of this come from? How did it happen? And those answers have been given to us right here. And they're the fundamental, it's the fundamental groundwork under which we understand who we are and why we're here. The origin of life and the complexity of life and the beauty of life. Where did that come from? We're not left, as George Wald is saying, well, it looks like life could not have come from non-life, and yet I'm going to believe that it happened. That's a blind faith, actually. And we're not left with that. We're left with the clear indication that God is the one who has brought forth life. He spoke it into being, and He spoke it into being for a purpose. The origin of the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars. And certainly it is possible, and Dr. Danny Faulkner will dive into this with you as well, it's certainly possible that God used a process instantaneously to bring them about as He stretched out the heavens. And yet, it's important for us to recognize that of all the things that God made, you cannot look at the original tree that God made today. You cannot gaze upon the original human being or the original tiger or whatever the cat-like creature was that God created in the very beginning. Dr. Woods, I love this, is the catness, okay? We cannot see those original creations of God, but there is one thing we can see. The original work and act of God. And it's what we see when we look at night and we see the stars. The sun, the moon, these are all the original creative work of God. And that is why I submit to people, it is impossible for science to understand when you look at the miraculous. We look at the miraculous work of God, and just as it would be difficult for you to understand the wine at the wedding of Cana. Scientifically, you couldn't make sense of that. And yet they're there. The origin of man, where we came from. Do we have meaning because we somehow are a lucky germ? We happen to be a fortunate part of this evolutionary process? Or have we been made in the image of God? And the implications of what that means. That we stand out from all of the creation around us. It is all spoken to us and given to us to understand that we are different than the creatures around us. We're different than the silverback ape that we had the privilege to see in the museum in Memphis. The origin of male and female. This is not a minor issue for us today. I mean, just from the standpoint of looking at the world around us and wondering how in the world is it that we have male and female in all of these living creatures, but in particular for us as human beings. That God made us male and female. It's how we understand what marriage really is in a culture that, again, wants to discard that there is any supernatural order, not only to the family, but to social order in general. And to the whole notion of sexual order and why we don't breed like cats. All bound up in the beginnings that God laid for us. The cultural mandate. What is our role in the world around us? Our relationship to the environment and why we should be the greatest environmentalists in the world. Not radical, not misunderstanding who we are in relationship to the world around us, but understanding we have been given a mandate to care for it. The origin of the 7-day life cycle cannot be lost on us. If you recall, if you know your history, the Romans tried to change that, did they not? And it didn't work. There's something built into the, as Schaeffer would say, the warp and woof of life in this 7-day cycle. And even the notion of a Sabbath rest is all bound up in the historical narrative of these chapters. The origin of sin. Why is there evil in the world? Why is there death? Why is the universe in decay? Which it is. Oh, I wasn't going to put this in there. The origin of the husband-wife conflict. Just read it. The proto-evangel. If you wipe away the historical narrative, you wipe away one of the most greatest aspects of the character and nature of God, who steps in at the moment where any of us, if we had made this creation and called it good, it was exquisite in its beauty, and now all of a sudden it was trashed. I just wipe it all away. Like somebody spilled ink on my sketch. Blow it off. But in the midst of that, God speaks the promise of the coming seed that will one day make it all right. The solution for death, the solution for evil, all spoken in that historical narrative. The flood, the geological understanding that we now have of the world around us, and why there are so many creatures buried in mass graves all over the world. The origin of people groups and languages. Yeah, Dr. Petrovich will talk more about that. Because quite frankly, we have this Cambrian explosion regarding languages. It's weird, and it's not weird if we understand what God has told us. But probably the most important, as we come down to our end here, is the veracity of the rest of the Scripture. Because you see, the Scripture over and over again, hundreds of times, points back to these opening chapters, referencing them as if they are historically true. If you take that away, then we have to ask the difficult question, how can the rest of this be right? Even Jesus himself pointing back to Noah, to Jonah, these historical characters. And I know Jonah is not in these first 11 chapters. But still, it is Jesus pointing back to these characters, not with some different framework for Noah than for Jonah, but as if they are historical characters. And finally, the character of God. Because to me, it seems the most important thing that we understand from the historical narrative that has been delivered to us here is to understand who God is. Yes, he's a God of order. He is the God of life. He's the God of compassion. We understand that throughout the rest of the Scripture. And there's the God of compassion who spoke the proto-evangel when he should have just wipe them out. We understand that God is the God who cares for me. Yes, He is the God, He is the holy God who judges. But He judges in order to save. And this to me, and it will end with this, but this to me is one of the most key aspects of understanding of what the difference is if we take this and we rewrite it into something that is different than the historical narrative. And we begin to believe that this philosophy and the science which has wedded to it is right and true. And it's taught to us everywhere. It's in the museums, it's in our classrooms, it's in our textbooks. If God used the process of death and suffering for millions and millions of years, then we have a God who is incompatible with what we read about God in the rest of the Scripture. The God who stands up for the needy. The God who protects those who are weak. The God who enjoins us and commands us to care for the weak and the sick. That is the God who has been shown to us. That is the God we know. And I would submit to you that as a God who is incompatible with the God of evolution, who would somehow delight in the suffering of the weak, who would somehow delight in the flopping around of creatures as they're attempting to work out some aspect of their evolutionary form and being eaten by the stronger. That is not the God who commands us to care for the weak. That is the God who cares for the desperately lost. Because quite frankly, my friends, that is the heart of the gospel. It's the God who cared for us in our lost condition, our finite, frail, lost condition, is a God of compassion. That is not the God of the box. But it is the God that we see from the beginning in Genesis over and over again and through the rest of the Scripture. I'm excited about what lays ahead of all of us, the privilege we have to hear from these incredible scientists, and I pray that God is going to work this week for you in a way that He brings your mind not only to these great scientific thoughts, but He brings your mind to Him. Thanks. God bless.
Hallelujah.